And we're back here with author Jonathan Smith of the very popular new book, Island Flames. Now, Mr. Smith, if you could draw a correlation between then and now, Bermuda right now seems to be very divided again. You can't help but to ignore it through media, through social media, etc. I've heard some people say that they think that Bermuda's headed for a riot, but I've heard it over the last maybe 5 to 7 years. Do you think that the atmosphere is like that again, like it was back in the 70s?
Well, let me first address what issues might still be the same before I get into the specifics of whether there's a risk to public order, because I think there's fundamentally two very separate issues. On the issue of what's the same and what's different, one of the things I looked at in Island Flames was to really examine what the two royal commissions were saying, 1968 and 1977. And one of the things I did in the book was to actually ask an eminent researcher and former government statistician, Cordell Riley, to write a chapter in the book to address that fundamental question. What's changed and what's different since 1977? So if we're to look at some of the major issues, and there are about 5, the racial dynamic was very much forefront of what happened in 1977. In fact, the Royal Commission said that race was at the core of the disturbances and the core of the problem. We still had, back then, an underperforming public education system. So start to think in your mind about what's still the same now, and there is a striking similarity. The race issue is still unresolved on some levels. The education system is still unresolved. We're still not producing the results we need to. Curiously, immigration policy came under a huge amount of criticism in the 1968 Royal Commission and the 1977 Royal Commission, and is still subject today of a lot of skepticism, a lot of doubt, and a lot of controversy about who's benefiting from the immigration system. Access to economic opportunity would be about the 4th big issue, and that, once again, with employment numbers running high, is rising in attention. So those first 4 issues are ones which are very much prominent in 1977. There's still issues that the community and the politicians are talking about today. The 5th one I left on its own because it's arguable that out of all the 5 big issues, the 5th has probably been the one that's most been resolved. That's the franchise. The history of the voting pattern in Bermuda was very leveraged towards the white population. That really wasn't addressed until 2002 constitutional change and the 2003 election. For the first time, one man, one vote of equal value. So it's arguable that the franchise, out of those top 5 issues, the franchise is the only one that's been resolved. On the public order side, do we run the risk now? I was involved in a national security report which was finished last year. And one of the underlying sort of tension issues was the gang problem, and one of the sparks, as it were, of any sort of large outbreak of public disorder was believed by the police at that time to be something gang related. I think that dynamic's changed a little bit in that now you have a large part of our population unemployed. There's lots of criminological research which links poverty and unemployment with crime and public disorder as well. So I would say this, that there's a rising risk, I would say. I've heard the same things that you've heard about the rising tension out there. So I think there's some connection between the two. Those 4 remaining sort of what I call big issues, and that's now layered with unemployment, dissatisfaction. So that's always a recipe a country needs to be very, very mindful of in terms of the risk of public disorder, yes.
Now, going back to your time as the commissioner, through research, has it made you look at yourself in the sense of, as a white man, and the discoveries that you found along the way, has it made you reflect in any way of maybe your mindset then versus now?
Oh, very much so, very much so. I was, born into a family that many think had very long roots in Bermuda, and part of my family does. But most of my family is actually American. 3 of my 4 grandparents are American, so I had a slightly different sort of background, as it were, to other parts of our Smith family. And I say that because I think you've got to know where you've come from. All my first cousins are American. I have no first cousins in Bermuda. So again, I say that to say that I can't be sort of pigeonholed into, oh, he's a Smith, that meant certain things. My father came to Bermuda in 1959 with nothing other than his first month's rent money in his pocket. So everything he built here. He didn't inherit anything, he built from the start. And that, I believe, gave all of us, my brothers and my sister and I, a bit of a foundation that was slightly different. Fast forward to the police career, and I definitely look at things very differently. It wasn't until I finished in the police that I really reflected back and realized that the issues I was dealing with as a senior professional police officer were, yes, they were law enforcement issues, but there were also issues so deeply connected with the social fabric of Bermuda. And it caused me to reflect what was causing this generational transmission of problems. The Pitt Commission called it transmitted deprivation, where the social ills of one generation are passed to the next. And that's what I saw as a police officer. So it caused me to sort of reflect and revisit some of my thinking, and basically to try and then contribute to solutions. And I was very clear when I made my statement when I became politically involved in 2009, was that I refused to be corralled into where whites were expected to be corralled, and into what was then a UBP block voting pattern. And I felt very comfortable with making that decision because I knew who I was as a person, and sort of fearless in terms of I can stand by my decision.
Any regrets, or if you, during your career as police commissioner specifically, is there anything you, looking back, you feel that you could have either done differently or spearheaded differently?
One of the main objectives of police leadership, and it hasn't changed, was to provide a direction for the service. So I've no doubts about what we did in terms of putting a strategic plan together, reshaping the police service to make it more in what's called intelligence-led policing. And although that was now almost 14 or 15 years ago, those roots are still in place. There is still an intelligence division in the police, so I'm proud of that. We started the police support unit, and we really made the first efforts at a community-based policing model, which is still going to this day. So would I do things differently? Yeah, I think anytime you're in the position of leadership, you've got to be sensitive to what some of the current issues are, and that's one of the challenges of the current commissioner. He can't do some of the things he might want to do because of the resources he's got to direct towards anti-gang enforcement. So I guess I would do things slightly differently. I probably would have moved quicker to resolve some of the community-based issues, but we had a lot of things to overcome. The community wasn't quite ready for the type of interaction we were proposing between 2000 and 2005. So a lot of the groundwork was laid while I was there, and a lot of the activities actually happening now because the community is more comfortable working with the police.
Okay. And we'll have more from Mr. Smith when we return.
The criticism was from a very, very narrow perspective as far as I can gather. Anybody's entitled to criticism. Any book that comes out can be criticized.